Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is David Livingston, and I lead our work on climate and advanced energy here at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. It's terrific to see so many friendly, familiar faces in the crowd. And we really appreciate you coming out this morning, particularly in a week where I know there's no shortage of distractions in Washington, political and otherwise. Let me begin this morning by thanking my colleagues Zach Strauss, Mitali Merla, and our terrific events team here at the Atlantic Council. I'm extremely grateful for their help, and this event wouldn't have been possible without them. When it comes to the global fight against climate change, we find ourselves this morning here approaching the end of November at a very unique inflection point. We're roughly 2 weeks away from the commencement of the COP25 UN Climate Conference, which is to take place in Madrid at the beginning of December. And we're roughly only 2 weeks after the official notification from the Trump administration to the United Nations of its intent to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. The story of state, local, and other private sector climate action, which is often colloquially, if somewhat inelegantly, referred to as subnational climate action, has truly become a noteworthy story, though. The group America's Pledge, with whom we are very proud to be convening this morning's event, is calculating the GDP of various different subnational actors that remain committed to the Paris Agreement. And the collective scale of GDP of all of those actors that are being counted and tracked approaches something close to $14 trillion. To put that in perspective, that means that an economy larger than the size of China still remains committed to the Paris Agreement within the United States. It takes a number of the traditional received wisdom or conventional wisdom on the nature of action and inaction and turns it on its head and complicates it further. But this is increasingly and importantly for our event here this morning, not just a domestic story. This isn't just about we're still in or a grouping of bold mayors and governors and CEOs that are working to backstop a comparative lack of ambition on the part of the federal government. From Argentina to Japan to South Africa, new subnational climate networks are emerging to turn high-level commitments into action, to fill in gaps, to raise global ambitions yet higher. It is still early days, and there are many outstanding questions about exactly what shape all of this subnational climate action will take, how these networks will be linked together, and how ultimately they will impact global level ambitions as articulated by nation states in the UN climate process. But it is clearly a trend to be taken seriously and a valuable tool in the all hands on deck effort to address the climate challenge. But first, we're very excited to begin today's event by taking the pulse of climate policy discussions on Capitol Hill. We're honored to be joined by Alison Cassidy, Deputy Staff Director for the Majority at the U.S. House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. For the past year, Alison has been working diligently with committee colleagues to gather evidence, new and old, of the impacts that climate change is already having on American society and on the tools available to us to address it. We were originally planning to be joined by Alison's counterpart on the Minority, Dave Banks, but he was unfortunately unable to participate due to a last-minute meeting. That meeting was with some of the leadership from his side of the aisle, though, I think is encouraging, and we're hopeful that it's a productive one. There is still much to discuss, though, in terms of what's happening on climate change in Congress, where U.S. climate action is headed, and what impact subnational climate action has in this entire picture. So without further ado, let's jump right into a 30-minute discussion with Alison, and then we will proceed to bring up our panelists to dive a little bit deeper into the nature of subnational climate action. So Alison, first of all, thank you very much for joining us. And maybe it's appropriate to start off just by telling us, level setting with us, what is this Select Committee on the Climate Crisis? How does it differ from other House committees? And what's your mandate and your goals?
Starting with an existential question. So the Select Committee, a Select Committee is one that exists only for a particular Congress. So the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis exists only for the current 116th Congress. Speaker Pelosi created us in January of this year, and we have a very broad but specific mandate, and we are charged with identifying policies that Congress should pursue to solve the climate crisis. So that's obviously huge. But then she gave us a very specific task, which is by March 2020, which is rapidly approaching, if we have any specific policy recommendations to the standing committees of Congress, those who have legislative jurisdiction, we have to make those recommendations by then. And so that is the deadline that we're kind of barreling toward. And we have been meeting with stakeholders and holding hearings we really got up and running about 8 months ago. And so that's where we are. What was the second part of your question? I think I might have missed it.
I think it was just kind of the mandate and then the ultimate goals as well.
Right. And
at least as you see them at this point in the process.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, our goal is to, we're not starting from a blank piece of paper here. Members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, but primarily from the Democratic side, have been working pretty hard behind the scenes to come up with climate policy solutions, sector by sector, but also economy-wide. And so our goal is to look at the breadth of work that has been done, identify what are the goals Congress needs to try to achieve, look at the work that's already been done, and identify gaps. Where hasn't Congress acted? What else do we need to do so that when a political window opens for climate action, we're ready to go?
Excellent. And based on the committee hearings you've had so far, what's your general sense of optimism versus pessimism on the areas of bipartisan agreement, or let's say the middle of the Venn diagram, where you think there might be some opportunities to really drive ahead action because both the majority members and the minority members see some value in cooperating there?
It's a good question. First I'll say that, and I think my Republican counterparts would agree, is that the tenor of our hearings has been less partisan than the other committees in Congress. We've been able to have a dialogue and have hearings where we have open discussion, even if we don't agree. There hasn't been a lot of bomb throwing from either side, unless it's playful jest between the ranking member and Mr. Huffman from California. They serve on like 3 committees together, so they know how to push each other's buttons and enjoy it. But other than that, it's been, even the day we had the first impeachment hearing on the Hill, we had a hearing about industrial emissions, and it was remarkable the difference. Like, people could come into that hearing room, have a discussion about cement or concrete, depending on which term you were using. There was a debate about which was the proper one, and have a real discussion about what do we need to do. So I do think there will be places where we will be able to find some bipartisanship. I don't know if it's going to be a very broad set of shared policies, but there will be places where we can agree moving forward. It's just a matter of figuring those policies out.
Terrific. And of all the committee hearings you've had thus far, because you've had quite a few now, which has been the most interesting, or which has been the most counterintuitive? I imagine many of them play out as one might expect them to play out, but some of them surely have some surprises, or have some, have something in them that makes them particularly memorable. Are there any that stand out to you? They're each memorable in their own way, and also the best hearing is the one that's over, I always say. But there have been a few that stand out to me as being particularly useful or important. One is the industrial emissions hearing that I just mentioned. It's the industrial sector is one that's going to be very difficult to decarbonize, but there seemed to be a lot of bipartisan agreement that, first of all, that it's possible, but that there's going to need to be government intervention in some way, whether it's through incentives or grants, or just definitely more government R&D to help make that happen. And so that
I actually found a hearing about cement quite interesting, which is great. And then we also had a hearing on heavy-duty transportation. There's been a lot of focus on Capitol Hill and elsewhere about, the light-duty fleet, obviously very important to decarbonization. But the heavy-duty sector, trucks, buses, airplanes, and ships, it hasn't been as much of a focus. In that particular hearing, we had two witnesses who kind of represented the communities that live near the highways, live near the ports, who bear the brunt of the air pollution impacts of those heavy-duty vehicles. And it was one of those places where you realize that the solution, the climate solution, electrifying those trucks, electrifying the ports, or finding other zero carbon technologies to move the drayage trucks around and and ship the goods, that has not only a climate benefit, but an immediate public health benefit to the people living in those communities. And it's not always that direct, the solutions. And so I found that hearing to be particularly useful to lift up that message.
Excellent. And so the recommendations will be given, what's the timeline for
our recommendations?
For your recommendations.
The looming deadline of March 2020 that wakes me up every morning. Yes.
Okay. So the Ides of March.
The Ides of March. Nothing else happens in March. Like Super Tuesday. Nothing else will happen that month. March Madness. But yes, it's by March 2020 is what the resolution says, is that we have to deliver our recommendations to the standing committees.
Okay, excellent. And those will get voted on, theoretically?
That is one approach,
Okay.
is that if we want to make this an official, these official recommendations of our committee, that means that our committee members, the 15 committee members, will have to vote on them. And that means that the recommendations will be subject to amendment and a full markup process, which is something that's pretty unusual on the Hill when you're dealing with a report rather than a piece of legislation. But for an official committee report, that's the process we'll have to go through.
And then you dissipate, you spontaneously combust, or what happens to the committee after that report is delivered, or those set of recommendations are put forward?
It's also a good question. I do hope there'll be a vacation.
Okay.
Just a small one after that happens. But I think, we exist until the end of 2020.
Okay.
And so we are not going to go away, and there will be plenty to do. First of all, we're trying to be honest with ourselves that, there's only, I think, 11 of us on the committee, staff-wise, and not all of us are working on policy. That's a lot of work, and it's a big body of work for a small number of people. So there might be areas we're just not going to be able to tackle at the depth that we think is necessary. And we might identify those in the report recommendations. This is, who knows, it's all subject to change, but we might say, this particular sector, we need to make more recommendations here, but we just can't do it yet. And so perhaps then we take the rest of 2020 to try to dig in a little bit more on that sector. Or we could do more field hearings across the country. We do have that ability to go into states, maybe identify, where states have had some success, in decarbonizing these challenging sectors or tackling the thorny issues like labor transition and environmental justice, and find out how they did it, because then maybe we can learn from that at the federal level. And then obviously there will be the presidential race, small thing, not remotely controversial happening. But our focus for March is very legislative. What can Congress do? But we might have the opportunity to turn it around and be like, okay, well, Congress and a new president will have to work together. So what is it that a new administration could do with Congress in concert? So there are a few options. We haven't really ironed it out yet, obviously, but that's where we are.
You mentioned at least implicitly, at the very least, the difficulties of trying to insulate your work, or at least allow your work to go forward despite all the noise around the 2020 election. Surely you also have to do that to isolate your work somewhat from the noise of the Paris Agreement withdrawal as well. How has that been? How is the looming expected U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, however long it may last, in the fourth quarter of next year? How does that impact your work or the discussions that have taken place in the committee?
It has been both directly and indirectly addressed in our committee. First of all, Chair Castor, who Kathy Castor from Tampa, Florida. She chairs the committee. One of the first acts was she sponsored H.R. 9, which was a bill to block President Trump from spending any money to withdraw us from the Paris Climate Agreement. All of the Select Committee Democrats were part of that, were sponsors of that bill, and it passed the House with only a few Republicans voting in support. And so that was something we took on very directly because, we think it's critical. It's critical for the United States to have leadership. The Paris Climate Agreement, though, has come up in several of our hearings, mostly because China is a looming figure in all of our hearings, as a reason if they are not doing enough, then that means we shouldn't be doing anything. That is unfortunately a lot of the rhetoric that we hear. And so I feel like from our perspective, the most important thing we can do, Paris Agreement or no Paris Agreement, is as the United States or the subnationals is to continue to act and to lead by example. And that's the best way to exert leadership in this world and to hopefully identify places such as in the industrial sector or in the clean energy sector in general, where we can take a leading technological role and then export that to the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. To become a solutions provider,
yes.
Not only to decarbonize ourselves. And so that fits in quite well with this discussion actually of subnational action as well. Considering that we're about to dive deeper into the subnational climate action landscape, not only in the United States but globally, how has subnational action leadership, innovative models from cities, states, companies, how have they played into the discussions on the committee, if at all? And maybe even just from your personal vantage point, now that you've gone through this process, what's your current understanding or your mental model of where subnational action fits and interacts with the federal level, climate policy and climate ambition?
Right. So we have definitely, even though our focus is on federal policy, we have definitely tried to look to the cities and states, particularly for policy ideas, and that has come in a few ways. I mean, just as an example, we had a hearing, seems like 2 years ago, but I think it was a couple months ago, about buildings and what do we need to do to decarbonize the building sector. And that's a place where the federal government has a very confusing and nuanced role. And so it really will be up to cities and states to take the lead on that. And so we, reached out to people in California, New York City, New York State, where they're actually trying to implement pretty bold ideas for how to decarbonize the building sector, and to ask them, okay, so you're doing this, what do you see as the federal role? What more can the federal government be doing to support what you're doing, to make it easier? How can the government get out of the way? And so that's just one example. I mean, another one is I kind of hinted at, which is, states like Colorado, New Mexico, they've passed, just in the last couple of years, so many states have come forward with 100% clean energy goals, both mandates and aspirations. And that's been huge and has helped socialize and normalize that goal on Capitol Hill in a way that even 6 months ago, it was not there. And that is extremely important. I can't emphasize that enough, that becomes just like commonly accepted. And then those states too, like I said, have dealt with these thorny issues that don't just exist within their borders. So what do you do when you shut down coal plants in your state? How do you ensure that those those workers who have good family sustaining jobs have good family sustaining jobs to go to? How do you ensure that tribes and the environmental and communities that are overburdened by pollution aren't thrown under the bus in the clean energy transition? And those are questions we have to answer at the federal level, and not every state obviously is going to be applicable to the entire country, but we can learn lessons. So, and then just on the last question you asked, one key thing we have to keep in mind as we're making federal policy is, how do we make sure that federal policy doesn't thwart the ability of states to continue that good work going forward? Mm-hmm. How do we not preempt them? How do we allow them to continue to innovate and experiment and adapt to their local conditions while we also try to achieve a national goal together? So that's sometimes a tough one, but it's an important thing to consider.
That's terrific. I'm going to end things there because there's no better framing for the panel that's yet to come.
You're welcome.
Alison, that was extremely thoughtful. I think very insightful for many of us here. And I know you have a committee hearing just later today that we need to get you to.
It's so not going to be overshadowed by any testimony on the Hill right now. Climate adaptation, impeachment. I'm not entirely sure which is going to win.
We won't show the audience numbers or figures, but thank you so much. We're really grateful for sharing your time with us. And we wish you and the rest of the staff on both sides of the committee the best of luck in continuing to try and forge these bipartisan
solutions. Can I add one quick thing?
Absolutely.
So we, as the committee, put out a request for information, 13 questions, and our deadline is Friday, but if you have, the 22nd, that's this Friday, oh my God. But if anyone out there wants to respond to it, it's not like an official EPA comment period where you have to end it by a certain date. Please respond. We are trying to collect policy ideas from anyone and everyone who might have them. It's on our website, climatecrisis.house.gov.
Terrific. So you can put in your 2 cents as well. Excellent. Alison, thank you very much. Thank you. That's really great. Thank you so much. Carla Frisch is Principal Carbon-Free Cities and States at the Rocky Mountain Institute. And you can all come on up now and go ahead and be seated as I'm introducing you. And there at RMI, Carla works to on ensuring that America's Pledge continues to do the great work of coordinating different subnational actors, cities, states, corporations that are working on all of these issues and trying to count their aggregate impact and just what magnitude those climate actions and those climate commitments have in terms of helping to maintain a robust U.S. decarbonization trajectory. And then finally, Nathan Holtman, at the end of this row, is Director at the Center for Global Sustainability and Associate Professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. He previously served from 2014 to 2016 in the White House on the Obama administration's climate and energy policy team, helped develop, in fact, the U.S. 2025 climate target, which I'm sure will also come up in our discussions and conversations today. Terrific. I want to jump right in, and there's much to dive into, not only in the global picture, but I want to play off of the conversation we just had with Alison and start with you, Carla. What is happening in terms of subnational action here in the United States? We are bombarded, I think, in a good way with stories of governors announcing different targets, mayors announcing different targets, corporations announcing different targets. How should we make sense of these, and what does the taxonomy of U.S. subnational climate action look like at the moment?
Great, thanks, and thanks for having us here. We're pleased to be at the Atlantic Council. So, subnational action. What do we mean by subnational action? We sometimes call it non-federal, or in the international sphere, we call it non-party. So we basically mean anyone that's not the U.S. federal government that's taking action. So the long way of saying that is states and cities and counties and tribes and businesses and investors and universities and cultural institutions like museums and healthcare networks. And you can see the list keeps going, but it's pretty amazing. And at this point, there's a U.S. coalition that now has more than 3,800 members that is committed to the goals of the Paris Agreement. So when we say 3,800 members, that's a lot. But what does that add up to? And David said this at the beginning, but I think we should just double down on this. That coalition represents 70% of US GDP. 70% of US GDP, almost. So that's bigger than the economy of China. It's only smaller than the economy of the US itself. So we're talking a very significant coalition. It represents 65% of US population and more than 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. So these are the folks in the US who are actively working to reduce their emissions. Now, there's a lot of different activities happening. I think a couple worth highlighting are the US Climate Alliance. So this is 25 governors, 24 states and Puerto Rico, who have committed to climate action. And when we say committed, it's not just they made some announcement. They are doubling down and passing policies that are actually reducing emissions in their states. And then at the city level, we have 430 mayors who are part of Climate Mayors, and they started back in 2014. Again, they are making commitments and they're really following through on those.
And on the mayors, President Trump is often fond, I think, of saying in speeches related to the Paris Agreement, and it's a clever line, that he was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh and not Paris. But my understanding is even Pittsburgh as a city is actually committed to the Paris Agreement and has a number of very innovative activities to try and reduce emissions and to try and harvest some of the low-hanging fruit that basically reduces energy bills and creates jobs as a result of the strategy that they've undertaken. Is that right?
Right. And
Yep.
in fact, there's a whole movie about that called From Paris to Pittsburgh. So Mayor Bill Peduto of Pittsburgh has stood up and say, actually, the citizens of Pittsburgh want to take action on climate. And the reason for that is they're seeing the day-to-day benefits in their communities of less air pollution, of lower bills. And now when we talk about cities, so what are these cities doing? So in the Climate Mayors, these cities have bonded together and said, hey, you know what, we want to procure electric vehicles. But if each city is figuring out how to do that on our own, that's a lot of work. So they're teaming up and they're saying, we're doing a mass procurement. So hey, market out there, we're aggregating the buying power of all of these cities, and we are going to make a mass purchase of electric vehicles. And on the renewable energy front, there's now 145 cities in the US that have committed to 100% clean energy. 145. And 6 of them have actually already achieved that goal, which is amazing. So those cities, they're talking about their own operations, like Philadelphia, who procured 70 megawatts of solar to help offset their own municipal operations. And also Albuquerque, New Mexico, they've just finished a deal for 35 megawatts of solar to offset their own operations. But they're also talking about the impact of the energy use of their entire city, of the citizens in the city. So they're working on that clean transportation, they're working on clean electricity, and lots more on buildings, on land use across the board.
Terrific. Nate, I want to turn to you. Given that panoply of different actors at the non-federal level, working to make various different commitments, various different policies, how do we link those subnational ambitions to federal level policies and ambitions, either now or into the future?
Thanks, and that's a great question. In fact, it's part of the core question of how these commitments and these good activities that Carla, I think, very effectively kind of conveyed do add up to something at the national level, and then something that could, we believe, to kind of address a global trajectory toward 1.5. And so this is something that we, in our work with America's Pledge, do try to answer in a couple of ways. And the first question that we try to answer is, what does it add up to? You know, there are a lot of cities, there are a lot of states, and a lot of businesses. Does it add up to something that's meaningful? And we did a report last year, and we're actually forthcoming another report in just a couple of weeks. Stay tuned on that. That do aggregate and assess the impact of all of these actions. And even our last year's report, which didn't include all of the new action in the last year, demonstrated that, in fact, the current commitments do add up to something significant, and that with additional action, they can add up to even more. Stay tuned for what that might look like if you add in federal re-engagement in 2020 or beyond. That'll come in the report this year. So the upshot is that yes, they do add up, and that's part of actually the core of what we do with the America's Pledge exercise. And then the question I think that is emergent, the kind of bigger picture question is, we know there's action happening. We now see that it can add up to something significant and in fact potentially enhance the ability of countries to do more. What does that mean for the current moment that we're in? As the world looks in the next year, year and a half to kind of engage with the Paris process broadly and to try to think about how we can get back on a trajectory globally toward 1.5 compatible pathways. This is actually one of the core questions. Number one is the coalition of actors that are coming together in the U.S. and in many other countries, as we will hear later in our discussion today. Can that strategy that we're looking at happening in the United States today transform our vision of what can happen to drive a different kind of climate politics that would support higher ambition, and even in those actions today, build groundwork for further action.
Terrific. Mariana, talk to us about alliances for climate action. What's taking place in other countries as well? I think that might be one of the biggest takeaways from this event, I hope, is that this isn't just a U.S. phenomena, is it?
No, it's not. And again, thank you for having us here today. I think that one of the things that is very clear is that the leadership of subnational actors that Carla and Nate described is not, as David was saying, just a US phenomenon. We are seeing that kind of leadership from cities, companies, and many other actors around the world. So take a country like Japan, which right now is not being seen as a country, as one of the countries that is leading decarbonization with very ambitious targets. Yet what you see is, for example, that Japan has the second largest number of companies that have committed to science-based targets. And as Carla said, you have companies that haven't just set those targets, they are delivering on those targets. Take Sony, which recently reported that they have reduced the emissions of their factories by 40%. They had set a target of 30%. They've already exceeded it. And we go on and on and on. So we are seeing this leadership happening, but the challenge that we're seeing again and again is severalfold. Number one is that we have these so-called domestic climate champions in countries around the world, but we know that we don't have enough of them, because if we're really gonna bend the curve of emissions at the speed and the scale that we require, we need to mainstream this approach and do so very rapidly. So we know we need to bring many more actors on board. The second thing is that we know that very much as the Paris Agreement lays it out, part of what made the Paris Agreement possible was that all countries have a common goal, but how we achieve this goal is nationally determined, which means that the conversations on the transformation are national. But what we're seeing is that oftentimes these cases of leadership are not known. The public, even though it wants action on climate change, doesn't know necessarily how much is already happening in the country. And what we're seeing again and again is that many of these actors are working separately, and that means that at a time when we really need to weigh in to get the right ambition at the national level that we need, we're not seeing it yet, because we're not having this unified voice across the board to show that these are not odd leaders, that these are actually the face of the new economy. So Alliances for Climate Action has come into place at a time when Paris is shifting from architecture building to implementation to support those actors that are on the ground trying to create this decarbonization from the ground up by connecting them to each other at the national level. And what we have seen has been a tremendous appetite for this. So we are still in the United States is the first multi-stakeholder coalition for climate action born in the United States. It was born 2 years ago. But what we have seen in the past year is emergence of similar coalitions in Japan, in Argentina, in Mexico, in Vietnam, in South Africa, and other countries are coming. And these are not just, as I said before, a case here, a case there. Some of these coalitions are already having important power. In the case of Argentina, over 30% of the population and over 30% of the GDP. In Japan, we have a similar percentage with the Japan Climate Initiative. So what we're seeing is this force of these actors that really want to shape the path that their economies take for the benefit of their own countries. And we really need to lean on those actors.
That's excellent, and I think very illuminating for something we don't see a lot in the news, actually. Pankaj, what needs to be done? We just heard about this diverse geography of different subnational climate action networks, which is growing from Southeast Asia to Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia and beyond. What needs to be done to catalyze their growth further and to have them feed up into increased national ambitions?
Mm-hmm. First of all, thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity, and to everybody who is here for coming to listen to this very interesting and I think extremely relevant discussion to the political context that we see here in the US, but also I think maybe one can say somewhat also driven because of the US political context, what we are also seeing in other major developing economies, including China, India, Mexico, and a few other places, which I thought 3-4 years back were in a very good spot in terms of the question and the issue of ambition, but now they appear to be moving into a different place. And I think that kind of also sets the context. And to your question, I think in terms of what can be done, I would frame this conversation in terms of three important pillars. One is the issue of science, not just science in terms of what we understand, the audience here and many in developed economies, but also for common people. Do they understand and do they accept the science or not? And do they make the connection between the science and the impacts that they are experiencing actually? Second is whether we have a very compelling economic case for the solutions that we want to pursue. Third is whether there is a political case here. And on all these three fronts, I think we are finding that the subnational action, the non-state actors, actually the mobilization of these initiatives are playing a very important role. And I think this is the space where we need to also look into, even though at the top level the political context may not yet be visibly moving in the direction of ambition. But I think if the work could be done, amplified, further strengthened at the non-state actors level, I think that foundation is going to be an extremely important contribution to whatever decisions will further come in the national space. I just want to highlight a couple of points here and then connect to some, I think, solutions that we think are very important. From the science perspective, we all see IPCC 1.5 report and also the growing frequency of record-breaking temperatures and intensity of extreme weather events, not just in the US, but all over the world. And that I think people are beginning to ask why this is happening. And even though in some places still those connections are not made, and I think in the US it is very visible that there is a very partisan link made to even when you experience such events, you still do not draw the conclusion and make the connection to climate change. But fortunately, that is not the case in many other countries. That kind of political divide is not there, and people are making those connections. And the non-state actors' initiatives, even though they are focused on drawing out plans and in terms of action plans, but I think that whole process creates a dialogue at the ground level, and that actually becomes extremely important input. We know that the current pledges of NDCs do not add up. We will not, if with these NDCs, we will not be able to maintain the world below 1.5 degree. And in this context, IPCC also has said it will be required, if we have to meet the 2050 goal, the 1.5 degree goal, all cities in the world will have to become carbon neutral. It's not just cities in the developed countries, all cities in the world will have to become carbon neutral, otherwise we are not going to achieve it. And then further, I would just share some data here. I think in terms of how we are seeing the momentum is building up. I don't know how many of you here are familiar with a UNFCCC maintained database called NASCA. Can you raise your hand if you know about this? Very few people. So I just would like to inform you that there is a global database which is being maintained by the UNFCCC, the United Nations body, which is overseeing the climate change processes. And we have in 2015, in 2018 now, right now, we have about 15,000 actors who have registered 23,000 actions, non-state actors action into this database. And this has increased twice. It was 2 years ago, it was half this number. And so it shows in the last 2 years how the non-state actors mobilization has actually picked up in a very significant way. Then in the Climate Action Summit in New York, just last month, 2 months back, there were over 200 non-state and subnational actors who made public announcements about achieving net zero goal by 2050. So again, I think that momentum is picking up. And science-based target setting was mentioned already. There are 685 companies that have joined the science-based target setting initiative from all over the world. And we are seeing about 12 companies joining per month recently. The rate has really increased and picked up quite a lot. But now coming back to what you were asking me, even though we see that this kind of a momentum is building up, to me it seems that it's what is not clear is whether these actors will actually achieve their commitments or not. Even though they are, I think, being very courageous, and it adds to the positive momentum as more and more cities take that courageous step. The challenge that I think we face is how do you help them to become more successful? And I think part of that, the trick here is to be really not just the financial resources. I think financial resources of course are required, but why the financing? They're not able to attract financing. And I'll stop here, just one last point on this issue. They need financing, of course. They need also technologies and solutions, but in many cases solutions are already there, but they don't have the financing. And I think it's paramount that we have credible measurement and reporting in terms of what we can, there is a transparency about what they have committed to achieve. There is a transparency about the progress that they're making and opportunities, because unless you have credible data, it's not easy then to make a proposal to financiers, even private sector, public sector as well. And right now what is happening is there's so many different measurement methodologies or kind of reports that analyze the contribution of these actors in so many different ways that it has caused a lot of confusion. And I think it is leading to a situation where I think there's a question of trust, whether one can even trust the contribution that these commitments will make. And I think so. I think there are two other solutions also that we need to consider. But the first that I would most highlight is that we need a common global standard on how do you account for these commitments.
Okay, so I want to go out to the audience soon to reward you for being here and to get your excellent questions and wisdom. But I want to follow up on that point right here too. We often hear you can't manage what you can't measure, but maybe you also can't catalyze what you can't measure as well. So analytics are important here. You're all involved in those analytics in one way, shape, or form. And Pankaj, you just kind of set a high bar for what we need to aspire to. Further clarity, further standardization. Do some of you want to tackle this, say a little bit about maybe how America's Pledge is approaching this?
How about I start and then Carla can pick up then. So one of the things that I think is really a key innovation of the Paris Agreement is that the Paris Agreement, it's not just the nationally determined contribution element, but it's the element of calling the question from the nation states every so many years of what they can deliver. And out of that specific request in the Paris Agreement falls many, many things that I think are positive. One of the things that we are now seeing it calls is the idea that it catalyzes across countries the potential for having a conversation about what actions can be done and delivered to reduce a country's emissions by X date, say 2030 or 2035. What we are seeing now is that there are two parts of what this subnational story can do to feed that process. One part of it is what Pankaj was talking about, is like thinking about the analytical side, about how we can understand the potential contributions of all this action happening across the board. The way that actually matters in some ways politically, it's not just a measurement only, it's the kind of linkage that David mentioned. It's the measurement to management question, because it helps scope ambition in all these different levels. What can a city do? Well, they have a conversation about what they can do. They can use the political systems that are in their jurisdiction to build consensus around that strategy. right? And then you multiply that across all these different areas. That scoping process with the analytics helps build some ideas about what more can be done. And on the other side, as that is also happening in a very deeply linked way, you are building a different kind of politics to support climate action, right? You can build a different kind of climate politics to support climate action because you are, and I think as Alison mentioned in the beginning, you are kind of catalyzing these conversations, you are finding what works in different jurisdictions, and then you can aggregate those up through this kind of strategy that again is called by the Paris Agreement. And so that in a way is what we, there was a long time where we thought, I'm going to just sort of say something somewhat controversial, but like in some ways that climate action happened at the international level and the nation state, right? And what we are adding now is this idea, and this is in the Paris Agreement, that this integration of the bottom up is not just a kind of extra thing on the side, but it's a fundamental part of how you drive ambition.
I want to address this point on following through on commitments. So part of that is why make a commitment in the first place? So when we talk with a lot of corporations that are making these commitments, and they're saying, yes, it's great to help climate, it's great to help the globe, but why are we, a corporation, and Mars, for example, they're part of the We Are Still In coalition, why are we making this commitment? And one of the big reasons we hear from them is they are trying to recruit the next generation of talent and the top tier workforce. And what they're hearing from those potential recruits is, what are you doing on climate? And when they're looking at their supply chain and how they're growing their business, they're thinking about what's sustainable for us over the long term. So yes, they're committing to the global problem of climate change, but they're making these commitments for reasons that make sense for their businesses. And that's why I think we see them following through. And if you look at US emissions, so a lot of the early commitments in the US were on clean electricity, on how can we get more renewables, more wind, more solar. And now if you look at actual emissions patterns in the US, where we see those reductions are in the electric sector, where those early commitments were made, and now we see a lot of folks following through. And in the last year or so, we've seen a lot more commitments and a lot more activity on buildings, on efficiency and electrification, on transportation, and some on industry. So I'm predicting that when we look back a couple years from now, we'll start to see that downturn in US emissions in those other sectors following through on those commitments. And yes, it takes time to do this. We're talking about a shift. But the reasons that people are making those commitments are the same reasons that I think we'll see them continue to follow through and continue to see real impacts.
Please, Mariana.
Can I just come in on one additional point, and that is that I absolutely agree with the points that have been made that we need to, we need to understand, we need to ask subnational and non-state actors to set clear commitments and, of course, to follow through with them. I think we need to understand that particularly outside of the United States, we have a long way to go in creating a culture of disclosure. This is not just an issue for climate, it's an issue more broadly. And so I just think that we're seeing this, that as we're building these coalitions, we're trying to promote this principle of disclosure, this principle of it's not only important that you lead by example, but that you also say it out loud, publish it, and report on it. That is going to take some time. So the part that I'm just trying to caution us is that as we try to create the transparency that we need, as we try to create the mechanism so that we avoid issues such as double counting, as we try to sort out through these issues as a community, that we don't kick ourselves, and basically undermine the process that we're trying to create that has a very important purpose of shifting the behavior of actors in the real economy, creating the politics that we need as we're literally building the infrastructure for how we account this. So just being careful that we need to chew and walk at the same time.
Exactly. Building the plane as we fly it, so to speak. Absolutely. Yeah. I wonder too if we, so much of what you said is about basically one of the fundamental strengths of bringing subnational action into the conversation, into the architecture of climate action, is that it is rooted more so than any other in the local logic, whether that logic comes from the boardroom, whether that logic comes from, the city hall, whether that logic comes from the mayor's office or from a county government, it is rooted in a fundamental logic of action. At the international level especially, and in cities in particular, the mega cities of the 21st century, is there more to be done as well on perhaps taking existing concerns and even nascent actions oriented around air quality and local pollution? Look, for example, just at the absolute choking smog that Delhi has experienced in this, in this early winter season. Is there more that can be done to take that and to put it into a climate context as well, and to build that into the conversation? Please, Pankaj. Yeah.
First, I I wanted to also maybe respond a little bit on this push on in terms of transparency is a means towards an end. Transparency is not an end in itself, and I completely agree with what Mariana just now said, that we don't want to push it ahead in such a way that it can undermine the kind of mobilization that we first of all have to see. And so I see there are two parts to this. I think the first part I think is, and also then somewhat connects to what David was also asking. The first part is to, instead of maybe the word transparency, I would use the word analysis. The first part is to understand the potential benefits of local climate action into the society, to the maybe citizens in that particular community. And to undertake that, so you don't even have to go to disclosure, but still to understand in a much more credible way what are the potential benefits. You do need to understand how the commitment will translate into real results. And there I think one other missing piece that I think now has become very clear is that even though a lot of local climate action I think is inspired also by economic opportunity, particularly for those initiatives that have clearly seen that there is an economic opportunity. But what has not yet been tackled is the other side of the coin, which is the economic cost or the social cost to the citizens, to this community. And I think the analysis has to take into consideration both these dimensions. So when you speak about air pollution, I would not just talk about how the local climate action, for example, in the state of Delhi could actually help reduce air pollution, but also then translate it into in terms of the health benefits, translate it in terms of how it can improve the human capital in the local economy, and how that can actually further translate into productivity gains and overall economic benefits that are now actually not being realized. And similarly, I think the other part which is also somewhat missing in the analysis is especially I think I heard this story, this was much more shared internally within WRI today, that in China the plan actually is to set up more coal-fired power plants. And I think South Africa also, I don't know if how many of you heard the statement that South Africa gave in the UN summit, which was extremely good statement in terms of enhancing their ambition. But then the internal story that we are hearing is now that they are still proceeding with setting up more coal-fired power plants. And one common question that they all face, I think also is faced in the US, is what do you do? And I think someone commented on this in the beginning, that what do you do about the job losses? So when you are pursuing economic opportunities, so local state leaders are pursuing economic opportunities, which becomes the driving force for local action. But then there is a need to understand how do you also, maybe there should be local actions also to address the issue of job losses, because otherwise the political equation does not become complete and it's not picked up, because there is a much larger population of people impacted by job losses than the population that will benefit from the economic opportunity. Just with one data point in the end, the biggest company that is active in the coal field is in India. It's called Coal India Limited. It employs, just in the company itself, it employs 700,000 people. And then when you take into consideration its subsidiaries and its the whole value chain, the jobs that are linked to coal will run into millions. And so I think the so coming back to the analysis part, that analysis actually has to become holistic and to look into social impacts. Then I think it will strengthen our local action. And it's not just transparency in terms of disclosure. And then I think it also answers your question about air pollution. And that is a missing link right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. Why don't we go out to the audience and grab a few questions if anyone has some questions to start with out in the audience. Otherwise, I have plenty I want to follow up on. So start thinking. And then meanwhile, I want to ask as well about, kind of about some of the challenges I see personally, which is if you look at the news this morning, I don't know if any of you saw it, I looked at it briefly. Looks like EasyJet made a very, the low-cost carrier in Europe made a very ambitious carbon neutrality statement of ambition. Much of that will rest on offsets. Much of that will rest on natural climate solutions, for example. Is there a danger that as we get more ambition in one part of the subnational puzzle, let's say from corporations, that can look to source emissions reductions or avoided emissions on a global scale, that it's hard to coordinate and keep track of in our ledger, in our spreadsheet, in our balance sheet of emissions reductions opportunities and emission offset opportunities, that we get so much ambition coming from the corporate sector that some of our subnational actors as well as national actors with the offset opportunities, let's say the natural carbon stocks, the forests, et cetera, they're not able to accommodate these, or they're not in a position, they're not engaging correctly in such a way that they can tap into those opportunities. In other words, how do you look not just at the national and subnational interactions, but also interactions between different sorts of actors at the subnational level and what they bring to the table? Carbon stocks on the one hand, and bold, climate ambitions on the other hand.
Right. So I think embedded in your point is, are we going to run out of options or use up some of our options too soon to actually get the emissions reductions we need? So right now we're at the point where there's a lot more to do, so we can all be moving full speed ahead. But I think we do a lot of analyses, like looking out the long term, 2030, 2050, what are those pathways and what are the options? And you start to see, yes, if we're getting down to the tail end and we've been massively successful and we're figuring out how do you decarbonize those last hard to decarbonize things, for example, air travel, there are some interesting analytic questions there. And we start to think about, okay, what's the resource set that we have that can actually help us reduce emissions? So one thing that we consistently find from what folks are doing now and what the analysis tells us that we need to do is continue to clean up the way that we produce electricity. So generate clean electricity, and then use that clean electricity in our end uses. And by end uses, I mean our buildings, our transportation, our industrial processes. Now, something like airplanes, and we actually have RMI has an offset program, the Good Traveler, where you can purchase offsets. And I think that makes sense right now and will for several years. But in the long term, one of the solutions for air travel is biofuels. And we have jet fuels from biofuels now, and they're starting to be more and more integrated. And we see a lot of airports in the US making commitments on that. For example, the Atlanta airport offset all the travel from folks who went to a recent football game. So back to the original top point. So these biofuels are a limited resource. So how do we want to use them in this complicated puzzle of how we're going to decarbonize? And what we see there is that electricity is a very abundant resource, and that can really help us with a lot of options. And then biofuels, we need to be planning more carefully. But so this gets to the meta point of, okay, we have all these different types of actors, and are they teaming up to make a master plan? Some of them might be behind the scenes, but each city or each state or each business is making the decisions that work best for them. And it comes back to, why do we need that engaged federal government? Because we yield to them, the federal government, that master planning across, particularly for the US, what's the pathway on the policy and how are we going to have those decarbonization solutions that we can actually get to all of the different end uses?
If I can compliment Carla, I think putting on top of the national is why do we need a multinational agreement like the Paris Agreement? Right now, one of the key issues that was not resolved in the last COP was what is called Article 6, which is trying to look at the issue of carbon markets. And it is contentious for various reasons. That can be another seminar. But one of the key issues is how do we create a set of principles so that we ensure that that ledger is well organized, so that we're not having double counting, and so that we ultimately advance the key principle being advancing environmental integrity, so that we don't have somebody taking credit and saying that they're reducing, while at the same time somebody is counting and taking credit for the same action. The other thing I think it's also important to emphasize, and this is to underline a point that Carla made, is that companies and other actors may consider carbon credits, but I think that should not be the starting point. The starting point is how can you reduce your footprint within the control of the measures that you have, and only after you have exhausted everything else is then you go to carbon credits. Carbon credits should not be in lieu of the emissions reductions that you can make, and I think that that's a very important principle that it is important that we encourage and we advance. Otherwise, the risk that we run is that we go for these easy solutions while not tackling some of the important homework that needs to be done by each actor.
On the other end of the spectrum, I'll just mention, it's really exciting. I think it's an interesting approach, is the fintech payments company Stripe. I don't know if anyone saw this, but they have a very different sort of commitment that they've made. They're not only offsetting the carbon footprint of their own operations, which is largely really about just ensuring that data centers are powered by zero carbon energy, but they're also investing a certain committed amount every year into very expensive negative emissions technologies, right? What you may have heard about called direct air capture, where we're capturing carbon dioxide directly from the ambient air, where it can then be used for other purposes or sequestered underground. It's extremely uneconomic at the moment, but might become a necessary technology into the future. So what they're saying is we will be first movers. We will sink money that we know into what we know is not the least cost option, but it's because we want to do our part to bring a tool into the tool set in decades to come that might be necessary. And I think that's a really interesting approach for a company to make, and one that we might pay a little bit more attention to.
David, can I add just a little bit on this? It's not yet, WRI does not yet have a position on this, but I, as just an expert or researcher on this matter, would like to share some data points. In the IPCC report, if you look at an IPCC report, and we are talking about natural climate solutions, so basically reforestation and degraded land, you bring trees back to it, and you perhaps see an opportunity for offset. That is the simple concept. In the IPCC report, I think there's different estimates, but there is an estimate of 500 million hectares to 800 million hectares in the world that is degraded land and needs to be reforested. But when you also go deeper into the IPCC report, they have assumed that this whole land will be reforested for the world to stay below 1.5 degree goal. So what it means is that actually this land is not available for offsets. So any efforts that we are pursuing or companies are pursuing for offsets actually somewhat runs contrary to what IPCC has projected and what we should really be considering, that nobody should really now be entertaining purchasing offsets to reduce their footprint. They have to follow the decarbonization curves that have been outlined in the IPCC report. And so for the fossil fuel industry, they have to start to phase out fossil fuels and develop other business that does not depend on fossil fuel, but they should not purchase NCS offsets to try to stay below the 2 degree, 1.5 degree goal. And when you look at, but at the same time, the problem that we face is to reforest this land, we need financing. So for this land, I think there are many different calculations, and I would say multiples of trillions of dollars. And when you look at the profits that oil and gas companies are making, I'll just type top 5 companies, about I think $80 to $100 billion per year. And over 10 years, it will be about $1 trillion. And so the question that I think we are facing is, how do you link them? On the one hand, you want the oil and gas sector to finance some of this, but on the other hand, you do not want the oil and gas sector to take credit for these as offsets, because it does not work in the bigger equation. And so this is one kind of a big issue that we are facing. How do you incentivize financing at the same time not lead to offset approach, which can cause so many problems, and double counting will be there. And so that is, in a nutshell, what we are facing. Thank you.
Tricky problem. Yeah. I think we probably have a couple questions in the audience. Terrific. I see 3 right there. So why don't we take these 3 in the middle right here all together, and then we'll allow the panel to take all 3 of those.
Thank you so much. I'm Jacob Lee from Johns Hopkins University. So my question is, well, before I actually get to the questions, my comment is, United States is a wealthy country, and they could and should reduce more carbons. But having said that, I think there are tremendous differences between states. For example, the people in Texas, or people in California, or people in Wisconsin might have some different ideas about how the subnational governments can do. So how do you balance those differences? Like, economies are different in each state. So how do you balance it, and what should be the role of those federal governments, and what do those subnational parties want from the governments? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And if you could just hand that microphone right behind you. Terrific.
Thank you. My name is Nick Thorpe. I'm coming from Earth Justice. I wanted to ask a question about obstacles to subnational climate action. Something that we've already started seeing in the United States is clearly the fossil fuel industry being a huge obstacle to action. Inside Climate News had a really good piece about BP essentially turning its back on Governor Jay Inslee when they were trying to do legislative efforts on passing a carbon tax and dividend. Similarly, the LA Times only a couple of weeks ago had a piece about Southern California gas companies' efforts at the very local level of passing balanced energy resolutions, which essentially would thwart all of the state climate initiatives as well as policies that California has committed to. And so I was just hoping that you all could sort of talk about these obstacles, whether at the national or whether in the domestic or the international context, as well as possible solutions to sort of working with, understanding better how to move forward on necessary climate action at a time when the fossil fuel industry sees its profits sort of diminishing. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And right behind you. Perfect.
And I'm Dagmara Kuska. I work for the EU delegation here in the United States. My question goes back to what Mariana said about Article 6 and boils down to the international climate negotiations. And I'd like to understand the link between what is gonna be going on in Madrid and basically the subnational action and the action of business actors. Do you think that, for example, progress on Article 6 would be necessary to actually help them achieve their goals and succeed more quickly, maybe, or it is not really relevant to subnational ambition and objectives? And I'd like to also understand if maybe anybody from the panel knows whether somebody has already tried to quantify the Article 6 in terms of benefits. So, for example, if we do not achieve Article 6 agreement this year, would that mean that we are basically losing out on opportunities? Thank you so much.
Terrific. So we've got 3 great questions. Number 1, heterogeneity amongst subnational actors. Is that addressed somewhat by the fact that this is bottom up? Number 2, obstacles to subnational climate action. How do we work with entrenched opposition? Number 3, subnational engagement and how things are going to play out at COP25. How much of this depends on Article 6 getting worked out? What is Article 6 maybe for whoever wants to explain that in a little bit more detail as well?
I can explain Article 6 a little bit.
Great.
And please, Mariana, if you would like to add. Article 6 has 2 sub-articles, Article 6.2 and 6.4. Article 6 for all of us here maybe is a plan for setting up a new market mechanism under the Paris Agreement. So some of you may know CDM, for example. So one could say roughly, although not exactly it is like that, roughly like a new CDM which will be linked to the Paris Agreement. So it's a market mechanism that allows trade of credits between countries. And it has two provisions. One is 6.2, which is much more a bilateral mechanism. So it will be a system of trading between two counterparts, two parties, and they can undertake that trading activity. And then the second is 6.4, which is a multilateral mechanism. So which is going to be kind of a new CDM, and where there will be common rules. Particularly, I think the biggest issue is double counting, and how do you ensure that double counting is not taking place. So for example, if let's say hypothetically a large oil and gas company based in Norway were to purchase let's say NCS offsets from Brazil to meet its goal, and now whether those rights that they have on those reductions, the company, do they belong to also Norway? And would they also count towards the goal that Norway would like to achieve? And do they not belong to Brazil? So that means that Brazil should not claim rights over those reductions. So if both parties were to claim ownership on those reductions, then that becomes double counting. And so the purpose of Article 6, whether between two parties or whether as a multilateral mechanism, purpose is to really have good rules to address these kinds of issues. Double counting is just one. There is also an issue of how do you really quantify what is additional, and that question of additionality still comes into this. So I'll stop here, but just a quick one on Article 6. Yeah.
Thank you, Mariana, and then Nate.
So let's start last and then go back. So on the issue of Article 6, I mean, I think at least from conversations that we've had before, I think that there is an interest on the part of the private sector, particularly as it pertains to credits, on having clear rules at the international level for how this will happen. I think that, so I would say, there is an interest on the part of subnational actors for that to take place, to have a robust Article 6 outcome. Having said that, I think that we always need to lean in with the fact that this is part of the solution, but that we need to stage as I explained before. And I think Pankaj did a great summary of a very, very complex set of discussions around that. With regards to the other two questions of the different circumstances, I think you focused on the United States, but I think your broader point goes beyond the US, and the question around obstacles. I really think that, once again, at a time when the challenge is so enormous. We always use these cliche, phrases that maybe, feel like cliche, but I really think that we need to take them very seriously. And that is, this is truly an all hands on deck moment. And what that means is that we need to engage everyone. And the closest we are to the ground to implement these solutions, I think the better we're going to be able to move on them. And I'm bringing up this point for both questions for two reasons. So on the first one, on the different circumstances, yes, definitely there are different circumstances, but part of what we're trying to do is, in the places where we have invested in technologies right now that are technologies of the past, is really move to the technologies of the present and the future. And in the places that have to invest in their own development, leapfrog. And so that we actually take the lessons from what we know is now better for economies, for people, and for planet, and that we invest on those instead. And what we're trying to do is have these conversations be nationally grounded and locally grounded, so that addressing climate change is not seen as a burden, but rather as integral to solving the development challenges that we face today. And I think that the answers to that are going to be different in every country, in every city, in every location. And on the question of obstacles, definitely we have part of the, I think, the power potentially of these alliances at the national level that bring together cities and companies and universities and civil society organizations is that they can be that voice of the new economy that can counterbalance very entrenched interests. And we're seeing those conversations play out in ways that make sense for the country as these coalitions are taking hold. And we're also seeing signatories of these coalitions starting to have very local conversations, so that it's not just a conversation conversation about climate in general, but it's a very real conversation about Guadalajara and the future of Guadalajara in Mexico and what makes sense for Guadalajara. It's the future of Monterrey. Monterrey is a place in the Mexican coalition where actions are going to go next, and a key a key attractor of some of these actors is tackling together the issue of pollution in Guadalajara. And part of what we're seeing are networks, for example, not just the municipality and some companies, but we're seeing networks of mothers who have been working on this issue for quite a long time, engaging in this. And so if we make these solutions local, then we can counter some of these paid campaigns to start really providing a counter narrative that is rooted in the realities and the opportunities of different places around the world.
Thank you. So let me do a very quick, because I know we're might want to get in one more question or two. So first of all, well said, Marianne, on all fronts. Like, I agree with all that. And so I'm just going to focus on adding a little bit on this question of diversity in the different subnational action. So first of all, the diversity in the subnational action, as Mariana said, is a way to respond to the fact that there are different kinds of obstacles in different places. What our analysis is showing, and is America's pledge that last year and as you'll see this year, is that even with those obstacles, and even with many states maybe being sort of following states, like not being in the vanguard of the kind of very sort of front edge leading states, even accounting for some states that in this country, I'm talking about US as an example, that might not do even very much between now and 2025 or 2030. You can still deliver a lot of emissions reductions at the national level from the leaders and from the ones that sort of follow in the second tier or the second wave. But it's also not enough. And I think this is a key part of what we've sort of touched on occasionally in this conversation, but I want to make super front and center right now, which is that at some point you do need a kind of strong national response, in our case a federal government response from both the legislature and the executive, to deliver the amount of reductions built on those bottom-up actions across the leading states and maybe the middle level states that actually help bring up the rear, so to speak, in terms of the kind of ambition level countrywide. We don't get to the high levels of ambition that we know we need to be consistent with the science without what we're calling a comprehensive strategy or an all-in strategy that, as Carla said, includes both the kind of bottom-up and the kind of national level. And I think that is a model that would be consistent across countries, right? That you do need the integration of the sort of the bottom-up action, but with then supporting an ambitious national action that incorporates that and builds on the political momentum that is generated from the bottom up.
David, if I can comment, because thank you, Nate, for making that point. I think that one of the key messages that we would not want any of you to leave this event with is the sense that subnational actors can replace the work of national governments. We need to work together to get to where we need to go. And so what we are talking about here is that there is a tremendous potential in the actors, so-called the actors in the real economy, who can make substantial, large-scale contributions to the decarbonization that we need to see. But it would be so much better if national governments set goals that are really in line with the Paris Agreement and create the right enabling conditions so that these actors can succeed. And that means that there is, at this time, and given where we're headed in the coming year, we absolutely need national governments to send long-term strategies that are aligned with being net zero by 2050. We need governments to set NDCs, to look at their NDCs anew. NDCs, we all know these nationally determined contributions that would put by countries first in 2015. Everybody who was involved in that process knows that this was the best effort of the time, but the countries did not put everything on the table. We also know that there have been developments in the marketplace since. So this is an opportunity for countries to look at their opportunities, domestic opportunities anew, and say, what can we do? And what we want is by 2020 to governments to set their sights higher and for them to recognize that they have actors in their respective economies who want to work with them. So what we want is a so-called ambition loop, right? Where national governments create the right enabling conditions. We encourage actors in the real economy to lead, and that emboldens national governments to go farther. And I think that if we are creating this around the world based on national circumstances, we can get to where we need to go.
Terrific. We only have about 60 seconds left, so I'll ask you actually just a forward-looking question to end this, and then I'm sure we'll have some great conversations to follow once the event concludes. But imagine that you're briefing a president, whether a re-elected president or a new president, that for whatever reason wants to do more to motivate climate ambition internationally, and comes to you and says, subnational actors are not just in the United States, they're also abroad. How should the U.S. foreign policy apparatus engage with subnational actors abroad in a way that doesn't replace, but that does raise the ambition at the national level? What would U.S. diplomacy in a world that has networks of different global, subnational actors with climate ambitions? What would that climate diplomacy look like, right? In a post-nation state kind of paradigm, or a post-solely nation state paradigm?
So I'll try to keep it very brief.
Yep.
Two parts. One part is a very forward-leaning messaging and embrace of the subnational part of national ambition, and almost a setting of a vision, like using the sort of bully pulpit element to set the vision for how this can work. And as a part of that, to, in practice, ensure that our diplomatic apparatus is appropriately engaging with all the subnational actors that are out there, and maybe even doing things like meeting delegations and things like that. But I'm sure my State Department colleagues in the room and might have other ideas as well. But let me hand along.
What I would say is that I think that the United States is potentially very well positioned to, to do this. I mean, I think that on the one hand, as Nate said, the United States can include into its narrative that this approach that we have to do this together. I think that the United States can use not just its diplomatic apparatus, but it's all apparatus of development aid, and it has a history of doing that, really supporting actions at the subnational level in other countries. It can also use its trade, to really foster that kind of approach, and then it has cities and companies and so many actors that are engaging with their peers in other countries. Right now, for the COP, we're going to see for the third year in a row, a whole delegation of subnational, U.S. subnational actors going to the COP to bring that message. And so the national government, the federal government has its part to play, but I think that there is a tremendous opportunity to rely on the rest of the actors of the U.S. to really bring that message too.
Terrific.
Right. So I would say, Madam President, there's an amazing wave of action in the U.S., of subnational action. That's 70% of the U.S. economy and growing. And you are riding that wave to success. And it's all over the world. So Mexico, Argentina, South Africa, Vietnam, Japan, and growing. So this is the future. This is what's happening. Now, all eyes are on you at this COP and the next COP for how are we going to ratchet global ambition. And what we know is we can't get there with the federal governments alone. We can't get there with the subnationals alone. So we're teaming up, and we are all hands on deck.
And I think we got the US perspective. Maybe I'll add to this international perspective. You may be surprised to know that in many countries, particularly in China and India, they have made it illegal for subnational actors to enter into agreements outside the boundary, outside the national boundary. So my plea to the new Prime Minister or President would be to unleash the subnational climate action by making it legal for them to enter into bilateral agreements internationally.
Terrific. What a thoughtful and diverse set of answers to that. I think whoever is in office in the future and wants to step up ambition on this would be well served to go to this group of four on stage with us today. And thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. Thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us for this terrific event. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. We'll have some more programming coming up just after the Thanksgiving holiday. And in the meantime, enjoy some turkey and times with friends and family. Thanks very much. Take care.